Welcome to today's briefing hosted by BuildStrong America, the International Association of Emergency Managers, IAEM, and the National Emergency Management Association, NEMA. On behalf of our host and the Center for Homeland Defense and Security, the convener of today's discussion, thank you for joining us. Today's program will include an esteemed group of emergency management practitioners and experts who will discuss the complex intergovernmental system that underlies emergency management, disaster funding, and risk reduction as policymakers consider the critical and evolving roles of states and localities in managing disasters before, during, and after events. A couple of administrative items to note before we start today's program. All participant audio is muted and participant video is disabled throughout today's discussion. We will ask that participants rename themselves in the participant box to include your first and last name as well as your organization, please. And as a reminder, today's briefing will be recorded and the full recording will be distributed to all invitees after the broadcast. Throughout today's discussion, you're encouraged to submit questions using the Q&A feature in the webinar toolbar at the bottom of your screen. The Q&A option is also accessible under the More section on your Zoom toolbar if you do not see it immediately. Our panelists and our speakers will answer as many of your questions today as time allows. And now it's a pleasure for me to give you a brief introduction to today's speaker lineup. Today's discussion will first be facilitated by Chief David Paulison. Many, if not all of you already know Chief. He served as administrator of FEMA from 2005 to 2009 and also as administrator at USFA from 2001 to 2005. He also serves currently as a senior advisor for BuildStrong America. Our speakers today will include Josh Morton. Josh is the Director of Emergency Management for Saluda County, South Carolina, and today is representing the International Association of Emergency Managers, again, IAEM. Josh will be followed by Lynn Budd, who is the Director of the Wyoming Office of Homeland Security. Lynn is also serving as the current president of the National Emergency Management Association, or NEMA. We'll then welcome Colin Foard. Colin will be sharing some information to us today as his role as project director for managing fiscal risk at the Pew Charitable Trust. And finally, we'll also welcome Aaron Davis. Aaron serves as the Deputy Executive Director of BuildStrong America. Again, thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today. Chief Paulison, now I'll turn it over to you to moderate today's discussion.
Hey, Don, thank you. Thank you very much. With the Center for Homeland Defense and Security and the Naval Postgraduate School, you guys have turned out some tremendous emergency managers, the brightest and best, and you've been doing it for years. So I want to personally thank you for doing that and for hosting this workshop. You heard I'm Dave Paulison, along with being the former FEMA Director and Fire Administrator. I was the Fire Chief of Miami-Dade County for 10 years, a 30-year career firefighter. Served as the President of the National Fire Chiefs, and I am currently the Chairman of the Board of the National Fire Protection Association. I say that because as you look at the people that are on this panel, there's some really highly qualified folks here today, and we really are open to your questions. And you ask whatever you have to ask. You can't hurt our feelings, folks. We're way, way beyond that. Anyway, so we also appreciate you being here. We've invited the key staff members that are involved in emergency management, and the related legislation goes around that. So thanks for your time, and I appreciate it very much. And again, when we get ready, make sure you ask the questions. A lot of stuff going around about FEMA being eliminated, rebranded, totally disassembled and put back together. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on. We've got the FEMA Review Council going on. Congress is already coming out with some examples of what they're looking for down the road. So a lot of moving parts, and not just inside the government. The National Fire Chiefs has a panel together. I'm sure that NEMA and IAM has the same. There's other groups out there that are gathering together to get their input and to see what are we going to do with FEMA, or what are we not going to do with FEMA, and what's going to come out the other end. One thing we saw very clearly with the response to Texas, that the White House, the president, has made it clear that that is going to be the future response and the future role of the federal government in disasters. That actually falls in line with what we did when I was the FEMA administrator. We put together the national response framework as opposed to the national response plan. And that framework clearly laid out what the difference is with the locals, the state, and the federal government. You know, all disasters are local. They're all disasters are local because that's where it starts. And that's, you know, where the rubber meets the road and all that kind of stuff. But there has to be an overlap. We can't wait for a local community to totally collapse before the state moves in. So all this is a sequential system in there. There's also an overlap in that system. And that's really kind of falls in line with what I see the White House and the president doing. So anyway, as we move along, as we put this panel together, I'm going to turn this over to Josh. And Josh, if you'll start out at the local level and, you know, to talk about IEM a little bit also, if you don't mind.
All right, thanks, Chief. Again, my name is Josh Morton, and I am the local emergency manager in Saluda County, South Carolina. Prior to coming to Saluda, I spent about 5 years working for the South Carolina Emergency Management Division as a regional emergency manager. And then prior to that, I got my start actually working for another small county in South Carolina. Most recently, my county was significantly impacted by Hurricane Helene. We lost 2 of our volunteer firefighters on that day. 100% power outages for several days following the storm. Really went through a huge ordeal there, by far exponentially the largest disaster in our county's history. And I bring that up because I think it is really critical to understand the role that local government plays in disaster management, as we look at you know, moving forward with FEMA and where that goes. Before I do that, Chief did ask me to talk a little bit about IAEM. The International Association of Emergency Managers is the largest association of emergency management professionals in the world. We have over 5,500 members, the majority of which are in the United States Council. Over 5,000 of our members are in the U.S. And of those 5,000 members, almost 1,100 of them are in the Southeast. So we are a wide-ranging association. We have members from local government, state government, federal government, the private sector, higher education, healthcare. We really do run the spectrum of emergency management professionals. Currently, I serve as the first vice president. Carrie Speranza serves as our president until November. And we are very excited to be here and take part in this. Jumping back to the local role in disaster, one thing that I think gets overlooked a lot in this conversation about FEMA is the fact that all disasters begin and end locally. In reality, the vast majority of disasters, and I don't have a firm number, but I would be willing to put $100 down that it's more than 95% of disasters, probably more than 99% of disasters, are managed at the local level without state or federal assistance. You know, a lot of times a disaster doesn't even make it up to the local emergency manager. You know, you think of a single family residential house fire, that's a disaster to that family. And it's managed by the local fire department with assistance from non-governmental organizations like the American Red Cross, neighboring fire districts, law enforcement. All of that is happening. Emergency management is happening on that scene. Well, then we go a little bit bigger and we say maybe we have a small flood that floods a small apartment complex that has, you know, 5, 10 units, 15, something like that. Local resources are able to manage that disaster. You know, we work with governmental partners. We work with, you know, maybe a couple of state agencies thrown in there, some non-governmental organizations, again, to assist with temporary housing and things like that. But we manage it at the local level. The state government gets involved whenever we get to a point where our local resources can't manage this on our own. Perhaps we just don't have the funding capability to do it. I'm from a small rural county in South Carolina that's economically challenged. Our entire county government operating budget for a year is about $17 million a year. We have a neighboring county that their recreation department has a bigger budget than our entire county. And so it's very easy for us to get overwhelmed. And the reality is 61% of the counties in the United States are considered rural. So whenever you start looking at capabilities, local jurisdictions are the most resource limited. And so we turn to our state partners to help us with those resources. And then the state is the same way. The state's going to manage what they can with their resources, and they're going to reach out to neighboring states. But when you get to a point, you need to be able to step up to the federal level. And I know Lynn's going to talk more about that in her presentation. But what I want to mention with this is that, there's been a lot of talk about, returning the authority and the responsibility for disaster response and recovery to the state and local level. And the reality is we've always had that responsibility and we've always had that authority. It just doesn't always get seen because we're doing a good job at the local level and we're trying to manage as many disasters as we can on our own. Now, in order to do that, we do need support. We need federal support. One of the biggest pieces of that is preparedness grants, things like the Emergency Management Performance Grant, the Urban Area Security Initiatives Grant. All of these grants are vital to the survival of emergency management at the local level. And, as we talk about, wanting that responsibility to be at the state and local level, we have to understand that especially local jurisdictions like mine don't have the ability to make up that funding if it's not there from the federal level. And so, I would encourage you to consider that as we move forward with this conversation. Also, as we talk post-disaster, the Disaster Recovery Fund, as we talk about shifting the responsibility back down, one thing to keep in mind is that as we desire to shift that down, maintaining the DRF at the federal level is actually the most efficient and the most economical way to fund disaster response and recovery. Under the current model, funds can be shifted around to where they're needed, but if each state and local jurisdiction has to have our own fund, it's going to cost the American taxpayers a lot more money than maintaining it at the federal level. So again, we're at the local level, we're not asking the federal government to come in and run our disasters. We're just asking for your support before, during, and after a disaster. I know I'm getting close on my time, so Lynn, I'll turn this over to you.
Great, thank you, Josh. I appreciate it very much. Yes, I'm Lynn Budd. I'm the director of the Wyoming Office of Homeland Security, which also includes emergency management. I'm here also today representing NEMA, which is the National Emergency Management Association, and we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit professional organization for state emergency management directors mostly. And we're here to assist all 50 states, territories, 8 territories, and the District of Columbia to make sure that we can do what we can to support those folks at the state level, and which in turn helps those at the local level. As Josh said, everything starts and ends locally, and the state is prepared to do what we can to assist in those catastrophic times at the local level. In fact, in FY23, there were almost 24,000 events that required disaster support from the state level. Only 60 of those actually rose to the federal declarational level. So local jurisdictions are doing a good job, and states are doing a good job and doing a lot to support folks on the ground in those awful times that they have. But there is a partnership. Federal level has to play a part in a lot of what we're looking for from the federal level at the state level. While we're coordinating those state resources, we're also coordinating that federal support to that local jurisdiction. We need FEMA there to assist with that, not only with that coordination piece, but with the funding piece. We are one nation, and we need to have that partnership to make sure that we can all do things together. Some states have developed their own assistance programs, disaster assistance programs at the state level, about 32 of them. They all look different, just like every emergency management agency looks different, but we all do the same thing. We all have those skills and have the same responsibilities out there to get things done. Staffing at the state level also looks quite varied. It ranges from 20 to almost 1,900 folks at one state level agency. That's different. And it's also a situation where we have to work with elected officials, just like at the local level, to sort of tell our story and make sure that they understand the importance of funding and supporting those positions on blue sky days, making sure that we understand that that training and exercising, all of those things make us better responders. And that's where those preparedness grants come in place. They're very, very important for us to build those partnerships so we can respond quickly to those local jurisdictions and make sure that we're there and know what we're doing, have that coordination. NEMA also runs the EMAC system, which is the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. That is a system so where states can share resources. It's a governor-to-governor agreement to do that. It's a tremendous system that we use to support each other. We have to do everything we can to continue to make sure that that system is up and running and supported, especially if we're looking to states to do more on their own or with less federal support. We have done a lot of work here in the last year in trying to make sure we can give good information to the FEMA Review Council. We've looked at what we can do as states, and we're willing to take on more responsibility, but we still have to have that federal support. It's very, very important. The regional offices of FEMA play a tremendous part. They know the states that are in their region and have that relationship, and they know what they need and can bring those resources at a time when they know that when they've been asked to provide those resources at the state level. We've also talked to the FEMA Review Council about what we see as important as we begin to try and build more capacity at the state level. Again, those preparedness grants, EMPG, and also the State Homeland Security Grant are very important. In the world we're living in today, it's not only the hurricanes and the tornadoes and all of the bad things and floods that can happen, but we have nation state threats that are out there, and they're trying to weaken our critical infrastructure, which then has a direct impact on emergency management at the state and local level. So our mission is not only getting harder, but it's much more complicated. The State Homeland Security Grant also goes, 80% of that grant goes to the local level. Well, it might pass through the states. It's supporting your local law enforcement and all of those folks at that local level with that training and exercising and equipment that they may not have. Thinking about state emergency management offices, every single one of them is different, and their capacity to be as independent as you want them to be is going to look very different. Some states have a lot of independence now and are managing disasters on their own. Other states do not have that capacity yet and probably won't get to certain levels that other states can get to. For instance, Wyoming is a pretty sparsely populated state. I probably will not try to develop a USAR team, an urban search and rescue team, because we don't have a lot of urban. It makes sense for me to be able to rely on other states and know that they have that capacity built in their state because they need it in their state, but they're also willing to share. And that's what we have to do. We have to work together to not overdevelop capacity in different states and make sure that we have the capacity in other states to support. Right now is a very challenging time. It's hard when you have such uncertainty with the grant funding. The grant funding from the federal level, EMPG, and the Homeland Security Grant are more than a month overdue from when they should have been issued. This puts a big kink in our planning process. We're planners. We need to know that things are going to happen, but we can react, of course, for different situations. But it's very hard when you are working with elected officials and telling them, hey, we need these grants and we need to get it done, and then the grants aren't coming. It makes, we have local jurisdictions that are already combining their emergency management departments with other departments, which will then weaken both departments. For instance, our One county emergency manager now is also the PHRC, so the Public Health Response Coordinator. Both of those people are very important in a response, and they can't do both jobs at the same time. So while it's fine in blue sky days, it's not so fine in response and recovery. So I have a concern for that, and that is mostly due to the fact of uncertain funding. We pass through our emergency management performance grant to the local level, and most states do pass through about in the neighborhood of 50% of that grant to the local level. With it being a 50-50 matching grant, there's already skin in the game for both the state and the local level. We can look at doing some matching, a schedule for matching on the Homeland Security grant. That would be a good conversation. But again, it needs to be a conversation that is informed by local and state jurisdictions to make sure that the decisions that are being made by the FEMA Review Council, as well as Congress and the White House, are good decisions being made and informed decisions. That's our goal, is to make sure that we're there as a resource so that you can have all of the information that we have. We gather lots of great information and we're happy to share it. And we hope that you'll take advantage of that when you're going through your decision-making processes. Thank you.
Lynn and Josh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Good information and great presentations I expected. And Colin is going to step in and talk about where does the money come from to fund these emergency management agencies. Colin?
Thanks everybody for joining. And with the time I have, as Chief was saying, I'm going to be providing some high-level information about how we pay for disaster management in the U.S., some funding trends in that system, and Pew's recommendations for how to improve the way we budget for this critical work long-term. So as Chief said, I'm Colin Foard with the Pew Charitable Trust. Pew is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and public policy organization, and I'm part of Pew's initiative focused on supporting long-term budget stability, specifically working in states to identify, assess, and address their greatest emerging risks. And chief among those is the risk of rising disaster costs. So a lot of the information I'm sharing today is based on a recent publication called How States Can Build More Disaster-Ready Budgets, but it's also based on nearly a decade of research and outreach on disaster spending and budgeting, which is a really complex topic. I think we really only have time to scratch the surface today, but hopefully some of the basics that I'm going to be covering can be a springboard for any questions you might have or subsequent conversations. You can go to the next slide. So the previous speakers have done a really great job explaining how some of this works in practice, but for the sake of this discussion of funding, I think it bears repeating that each level of government, federal, state, and local, has a role in paying for our current disaster management system and covering some of the costs. Again, when disaster strikes, typically local governments are the first at the scene and the first to bring their resources to bear. When they become overwhelmed, that's when a state can step in with its own resources, its own kind of budgetary capacity. And of course, when a state and local government are overwhelmed, that's when governors can request a presidential declaration and the federal funding that comes with it. Here, I think it's important to note that federal assistance does not only come from FEMA, but at least 17 major departments and agencies. Some counts put that even higher. And there's also similar complexity at the local and state level, which Lynn alluded to, with funding and the activities not only coming from your emergency management agency, but from other state entities as well. I think it's also important to note here that some of the biggest federal programs are reimbursement based and have required cost shares for states and local governments. So while the federal government contributes significant amounts of funding for major disasters, that aid builds upon and is often combined with state and local funds. You can go to the next slide, please. So disaster funding is intergovernmental, it's interagency. It also includes a lot of different activities, which again, the previous speakers have spoken to. Dealing with disasters happens before, during, and after they occur, and to differing degrees across the country, states and localities contribute to paying for each of these phases, whether that's mitigation to reduce risk, preparedness, response, or long-term recovery. So to really kind of hit things home in this funding discussion, we have a really complex funding system that spans levels of government, agencies, and activities, and states and localities are really playing a few key roles in that system in terms of how we pay for it. The first is paying for those smaller disasters that don't receive federal funding. They're also covering required cost shares and matches for federal grants when they're receiving those. And here I'd add that increasingly states and localities are taking up the mantle of looking across their risks and vulnerabilities and really providing leadership and capacity building to address those risks through things like statewide resilience programs and initiatives. You can go to the next slide. So with that system kind of as the backdrop, I wanted to talk a little bit more about how disaster costs and funding have been trending in recent years. And some of this has been widely covered, but again, I think it bears walking through in the context of today's discussion. So the number of disasters with costs amounting to $1 billion or more has increased steadily over the last few decades. As you can see on this graph, the number of those disasters that occurred in the 2010s was significantly higher than in any previous decade. And here we are halfway through the 2010s, and we've almost reached that total. The average costs have also been climbing. So since 2010, these disasters have cost the public on average $116 billion per year, compared to $39 billion per year in the decades prior. So these figures, which come from NOAA, are focused on total costs to society. So that includes costs that are borne by individuals and the private and public sector. For Pew's work on fiscal stability, we're most focused on the portion of those costs that are borne by governments. And here, where data is available, we can see that rising trend hold. You can go to the next slide, please. So this chart shows the trend line of federal disaster funding, specifically expenditures from FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund, steadily rising over the last 3 decades. Here again, I would note that this is only a portion of federal funding for which there's reliable data to do this type of analysis and show the upward trend. Can you go to the next slide, please? So moving to the state level, data becomes more and more difficult to come by to do this type of analysis, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But again, you can see the upward trend mirrored in these 2 examples. So in Minnesota on the left, you see 5 times the spending on disasters in 2023 than in 10 years previous. In California, you see its fire protection expenses tripling over the last 2 decades. Here, I think the really important point to remind folks of is that states, unlike the federal government, can't deficit spend. They need to balance their expenditures and revenues each budget cycle. And so the tripling or quintupling of a category of spending can have major policy implications for states. And you can imagine, I mean, given Josh's example, even more constrained fiscal situations at the local level. You can go to the next slide. So these trends have really driven Pew's work to both better explain the complex intergovernmental disaster management system, but also to identify how states in particular, but also the federal government and localities could begin to get a handle on this growing fiscal risk. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but our research and outreach on this topic has really led us to light upon 3 overarching principles for getting a better handle on this challenge. So the first one, as you can see, is measure. We found a lack of comprehensive and regular tracking of disaster expenditures, and that's a major impediment to understanding their true fiscal impact. We therefore recommend more consistent tracking and reporting across disaster-related activities and agencies. The second principle, as you see, is manage. So disaster funding can either be proactively available, for example, through regular deposits to a special account or reserves, or reactively made available by passing supplemental appropriations or moving money around a budget after a disaster occurs. And here our research has found an over-reliance on reactive budgeting approaches, and we recommend shifting more attention, more planning and resources towards ensuring that sufficient funding is available for immediate needs in a way that minimizes the disruption to the budget. And the final principle there is mitigate. So the activities that I described just now shouldn't just be an exercise in tracking an ever increasing amount of disaster spending or budgeting more and more for it every year. We need to figure out how to control those rising costs through risk reduction. So our research has found that policymakers struggle to prioritize mitigation or efforts to reduce the risk and costs associated with future disasters for a variety of reasons, but that prioritizing investments in risk reduction as well as investments in the personnel and capacity needed to implement it is really key to managing the long-term fiscal risk related to disasters, not to mention the other important benefits it brings for communities and individuals. You can go to the last slide, please. So I know you'll be hearing from our next speaker more about the risk reduction piece, so I'll leave things there and just point you to where you can find more information about Pew's work at this intersection of disaster and fiscal policy And again, thank you for joining today and look forward to answering any of your questions. Back to you, Chief.
Colin, thank you very much. Very, very informative information. If you looked at the back of the first slide, the second slide you showed, cost of in 2005, the cost of Hurricane Katrina was absolutely phenomenal, and that's why we've got to be better prepared. Aaron is going to talk about risk reduction. So, Aaron.
Thanks, Chief. Good afternoon. I'm here to discuss a critical challenge facing our nation's emergency management apparatus, the escalating costs of disaster response and recovery, and how risk reduction and mitigation, combined with improved insurability, can fundamentally transform our approach to managing these expenses. As Colin noted, the federal government's disaster spending has reached unprecedented levels. Over the past decade, we've witnessed a dramatic increase in both the frequency and severity of natural disasters, with federal disaster declarations becoming an annual expectation rather than an exceptional occurrence. Despite a funding formula designed to avoid them, FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund has recently required supplemental appropriations, while programs like the National Flood Insurance Program continue to carry tens of billions of dollars in debt. This reactive approach, waiting for disasters to strike and then responding with massive federal resources, has proven both financially unsustainable and inadequately protective of American communities. Consider the mathematics of our current system. For every dollar we spend on disaster preparedness and mitigation, we save at least $6 in post-disaster response and recovery costs. Yet, historically, our federal spending has been heavily weighted toward the back end of this equation. We've created a system that incentivizes rebuilding in vulnerable areas rather than building resilience from the start. Nothing that I'm going to discuss today is necessarily new or radical. Congress and recent administrations have advanced significant policies and programs that begin to address this challenge, but recent changes will make near-term success wholly dependent on non-federal actors leading these efforts. Risk reduction represents our most powerful tool for breaking the cycle of escalating costs. When we invest in strengthening building codes, improving flood management systems, creating defensible space around wildfire-prone communities, and upgrading critical infrastructure, we're not just protecting lives and property, we're making a strategic investment in fiscal responsibility. Effective risk reduction operates on multiple levels. At the individual property level, it might mean elevating structures above base flood elevation, installing storm shutters, or using fire-resistant building materials. At the community level, it involves comprehensive planning that considers natural hazards, maintains and improves protective infrastructure, and ensures emergency services have the resources they need to respond effectively. And at the regional level, it means coordinating across jurisdictions to address systemic vulnerabilities that don't respect municipal boundaries. The beauty of risk reduction is its compounding effect. When we reduce the probability of damage occurring, we also reduce the need for emergency response resources, as well as temporary housing assistance, infrastructure replacement, and long-term community recovery support. Every prevented dollar of damage eliminates the need for multiple dollars of federal assistance. Insurability plays a crucial role in this equation, serving as both a risk transfer mechanism and a market-based incentive for good risk management practices. When insurance markets function properly, they create powerful economic signals that guide development and investment decisions toward lower risk approaches. When property owners face insurance premiums that reflect their actual risk exposure, they have strong economic incentives to reduce that risk through mitigation measures. This creates a cycle where risk reduction makes insurance more affordable, which in turn makes properties more economically viable and communities more resilient. However, our current insurance landscape faces significant challenges. In many high-risk areas, there existed insurance gaps that federal programs like the National Flood Insurance Program must fill. These federal programs, while necessary, often fail to price risk accurately, inadvertently subsidizing development in vulnerable areas and transferring costs from local property owners to federal taxpayers. The federal government should focus on creating conditions where risk reduction and private insurance can work together effectively. This means establishing and enforcing strong building standards, providing technical assistance and financial incentives for mitigation projects, and ensuring that federal policies don't inadvertently encourage risky development patterns. We must also recognize that some risks are so catastrophic or systemic that they do require federal involvement. Extreme weather is actively creating new risk patterns that challenge traditional insurance models. Sea level rise changing precipitation patterns, and increasing wildfire risk are creating exposures that may exceed private market capacity. In these cases, the federal government can serve temporarily as a reinsurer of last resort while maintaining strong incentives for risk reduction. Federal disaster policy should reward communities that invest in resilience rather than simply rebuilding what was destroyed. This might mean providing higher federal cost share percentages for mitigation projects, offering expedited assistance to communities with strong building codes, or requiring risk reduction measures as a condition of federal recovery assistance in the future. The economic case for this approach is pretty compelling. Communities that invest in risk reduction consistently demonstrate lower long-term disaster costs, faster economic recovery following events, and greater ability to attract private investment. Insurance markets function more effectively in these communities, providing better coverage at lower costs and creating additional economic development advantages. From a federal budget perspective, shifting resources toward prevention and risk transfer represents one of the most effective ways to control long-term disaster spending growth. Rather than facing unlimited liability for post-disaster reconstruction, the federal government can make strategic, capped investments in resilience that yield predictable returns. The path forward requires a fundamental shift in how we think about emergency management policy. Instead of viewing disasters as unpredictable events requiring massive emergency response, we must treat them as manageable risks that can be reduced through smart planning, appropriate regulation, and effective market mechanisms and investments. Risk reduction and insurability aren't just policy tools, they're the foundation of a future approach to living with known natural hazards. By investing in resilience before disasters strike and creating insurance markets that accurately price and transfer this risk, we can protect both our communities and the federal budget from the escalating costs of growing and extreme hazards. The question isn't whether we can afford to invest in risk reduction and insurance market reform. The question is whether we can afford not to. The mathematics are very clear. Prevention is not only more effective than reaction, it's just more cost effective. And the time is now for a more strategic focus on this approach, and we welcome the debates that we anticipate in Congress in the coming months. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Aaron, thank you very, very much. I appreciate it. Good information there. You know, right here in South Florida, we learned our lesson after Hurricane Andrew that we had to change our building codes, or we're going to go through the same type of damage again, where you saw hundreds of thousands of homes destroyed and hundreds of thousands of people displaced. We saw it in Katrina. We see it in other disasters. You know, I hardened my home with impact windows, new roofs, and those types of things. And even the state of Florida has a program to help homeowners who don't have those funds to harden their homes. Because we learned very clearly when you do that, it saves everybody money. It saves the state money, saves the federal money, and people get to stay in their homes. They don't have to go somewhere else and find shelters. So anyway, the panels, thank you very, very much. Great information, great presentations, and I really, truly appreciate it. So we got time for a few questions. And if you got questions, just type them in your thing there. Okay, one's already popped up. What's the most critical change you would recommend to better align federal disaster assistance with the state and local needs? I'm going to ask our NEMA and IAM folks to answer that, because you're on the ground with that. You see very clearly what we need to do.
I'll jump in real quick, Josh, and then you can make the corrections for me. I think the biggest thing that we can do is reduce complexity and give states and locals more authority and responsibility for handling that disaster funding when it comes to us. It's important that funding goes to the place where we need it to go. And that's what we know at the state and local level. We know where it needs to go, and we know the issues that are there. I think for the survivor, the most important thing is a universal application. It is, I can't imagine how overwhelming it is to have to go to multiple stations and multiple agencies and apply for assistance when hopefully you could just have one application to fill out for all of the federal resources that are available. That's what we can do both at the state and federal level to make sure that we make that bad day maybe not quite as bad as it is.
Josh?
I can answer this question in 3 words: simplify, simplify, simplify. As Lynn said, the biggest problem, and I'll tell you, honestly, the disaster is the disaster, and the second disaster used to be volunteers and donated goods. Now the second disaster is the federal paperwork. We love our FEMA friends to show up and help us. We hate the paperwork that they bring with it because it is insane. And we certainly understand the need for accountability. And you know, we want to make sure that taxpayer dollars are being spent appropriately. But at the same time, you know, the burden, the paperwork burden that gets put on us is crazy. And then, you know, as Lynn mentioned, the universal application, we have been trying for years to get that through, because as bad as the paperwork and the process is for us, you know, my mother-in-law actually runs our local nonprofit, and when Hurricane Helene hit, her and the other volunteers there spent days and weeks just helping people try to fill out the applications because it was just so overwhelming and so complicated. And applications get denied and kicked back over simple typographic errors and things like that. And we've just got to be, we've got to be more cognizant of how complicated that we make things.
Josh, you know what? I'm glad you brought that up because that's one thing I saw clearly while I was there, and how difficult it is sometimes for people to apply for something as simple as individual assistance, which isn't very much money. You know, and then I know when you deal with the public assistance piece of it, to get those projects approved from the local level to the state, and then from the state to the federal government, and then to get that money to flow has been very way too complicated. Yeah, I know why it was put in place. They're worried about fraud and abuse and things like that. But somehow we've got to simplify the process, but you'll still be able to put safeguards in place so we're not wasting taxpayer dollars. That's what it is. It's all of our money. You know, it doesn't belong to Congress. It doesn't belong to the president. It belongs to the people. And we're just in charge of spending it. We need to spend it more wisely than we have in the past, but still don't make it so complicated. So we've got a couple more questions here. We've got some time. How have funding challenges shaped your ability to prepare for or respond to disasters at the state or local level? You two guys, I'm asking you again. Because this is your
You go first, Josh.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'll take this one first. So, you know, I think that whenever you start looking at the local level, this is where it really, really hurts. Because, you know, I look at, for us, we're a rural area, so we don't get the UIC grant. We don't get SHISHUP money. Our primary source of funding for my office is the Emergency Management Performance Grant, EMPG. And we don't get a whole lot. We get about $55,000 to $60,000 a year, which is not much money whenever you're trying to spend it. It is an awful lot of money whenever you're trying to make up for not having it. And as of July 1st, right now, my office is essentially operating with no funding. My county pays our salaries. They give us a little bit of operational expense, but the majority of my operating budget comes from that $55,000 to $60,000 a year that I get. And you know, again, in a county where the annual operating budget's about $17 million a year, $55,000 is a lot of money to make up for us. And in South Carolina, and I'm sure other states have similar things, we're actually capped on how much we can increase property taxes in a year. And so, unfortunately, it's not as simple as we'll just raise property taxes by $55,000. We can't do it legally. And so it really is a big challenge. And unfortunately, that means that we can't do training, we can't do exercises, we can't buy equipment that we need, the supplies that we need. You know, if we use something and, you know, we can't replace it because we don't have money right now. It really is, you know, we're fortunate right now, we're okay. But if this goes on for too much longer, we're really going to be hurting.
Yeah, I would agree, and it's certainly more amplified at the local level. While the MPG grant is a matching grant and where you have that 50-50 share, it's still a lot of money for a local jurisdiction to put in the pot to make things happen. At the state level, many agencies, state emergency management agencies, are also funded with EMPG grants. Our office right now is 92% federally funded. We've been working hard with our legislature to reduce that, but it hasn't happened so far, and we're working to make that happen. 17 of my 23 employees are funded through the EMPG grant. So if I don't get that grant, I'm not sure what we will do. We will have to work with our legislature. We're budgeting right now for the FY 27-28 biennium. And I frankly don't know what to put in my budget. And I think that's the hardest part right now is we don't know what the answer is. If the answer is 0, I'm not going to like it, but if that's the answer, that's the answer. At least we know what it is. Again, we are on cyclical budgets, and we understand that, we get this grant generally in, we hear about it in the February, March timeframe, and we generally get the application open to us in the May timeframe, and that hasn't happened. So it puts a lot of stress and concern on both the state level and the local level for this funding. And while we'll see some bumps in the road right now, I think what the long-term effect of this uncertainty, and if the funding is reduced or taken away, is you're going to lose that capacity at the local and state level, because we need that to continue to train and develop new people to make sure that we have that capacity to handle those disasters at the local and state level. So it's a long-term prospect.
Thank you. Colin, the next one's for you. From a fiscal risk perspective, what are the biggest challenges you see in the current disaster funding model?
So I think, the biggest challenge of the moment is the overlapping challenges that, states and localities are facing here. So first and foremost, you have the rising spending and the rising costs that I talked about during the presentation. So even before the current conversation about the role of FEMA, we had been talking to states about the fact that, your costs related to disasters are rising and are not something that might happen, but something that is likely to happen. So how can you think about budgeting for that? So the costs were already rising. The second part of this overlapping challenge is public budgets are contracting. So we're coming off of half a decade of kind of record-setting revenue in states, pandemic aid coming from the federal government. That's coming to an end at the same time that states are facing higher expenditures for things like healthcare. So we're really entering a different budget environment when it comes to the state level. That's happening at the same time as this federal uncertainty that Lynn was just talking about. So it really is a challenging time for talking about this topic of how you pay for and how you budget for disaster management. And one thing that I think from the federal level would be helpful is clearer alignment of incentives and clearer messaging to states and localities that being proactive in how you budget for disasters, how you set aside your funds, how you create or build on your existing disaster funds or reserves will be looked on positively by the federal government as part of our nationwide effort to be more prepared for disasters. And clearer incentives and encouragement around risk reduction. That this is again a type of activity that if states and localities are able to make the investment and prioritize the investment, again, that will be looked on positively. That is something that again is moving the whole nation towards a more ideal scenario where risk reduction is the priority, and our approach is less reactive and more proactive.
Thank you. Aaron, the next one is for you, I believe. How can national policy better incentivize proactive resilience rather than a reactive disaster spending? Actually, that's a tough one to answer, I know, but that's the right question to ask.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I've got a couple ideas. So I think, for one, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018 was an incredible step in the right direction for advancing policy, federal policy that was intended to drive down these reactive costs and increase these proactive costs. It established for the first time a funding mechanism for nationally competitive pre-disaster mitigation program administered by FEMA that was based on a formulation of disaster spending, right? So it provided, several $billion in its first 4 years of existence. I think there's a lot of well-founded criticism of how that program was administered and how those awards were geographically distributed. But it was the first time that the federal government was really pouring significant resources into pre-disaster mitigation investments. When I worked at FEMA during the Obama administration, we would send out budget requests. We would talk about the importance of pre-disaster mitigation, and then stakeholders on the Hill would always ask, well, how much money are you budgeting for it in the president's budget? And it was inconsistent. And it was, some years it was under $200 million for the year. And they said, well, if this is so important, then why aren't you budgeting more money for it? So I think DURA, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, and the pre-disaster mitigation program that was funded by it is a significant type of policy that addresses that. I think from a tax policy perspective, there are multiple bills that have been introduced over the last several Congresses that would provide tax credits to individual property owners, whether they are residential property owners or non-residential property owners, to make resilience retrofits to their properties and provide them with a tax credit for doing so. Right, that's one more tool in the toolbox to reducing that risk and that exposure. The cost is then not borne by the federal government; it's borne by those property holders making those investments. But there is some incentive for them to undertake those investments. There's also, I think, very hotly debated idea of whether or not there needs to be a sliding scale premium for federal assistance for disasters based on some type of analysis of each state's posture with regard to risk. So maybe states that are not adopting a statewide building code or adopting a statewide building code that is decades out of date maybe gets less of a federal cost share for a disaster declaration under Stafford. That's not going to happen anytime soon, but it is something that has been debated in the past, including in the debate surrounding DURA. And then there's also, from a regulatory perspective, FEMA and states sign a FEMA state agreement when FEMA comes in and provides federal assistance. There is nothing there. While there are requirements on FEMA programs for publicly funded infrastructure repair and restoration, there is nothing in that FEMA state agreement that conditions future aid on a state adopting a code, a more modern code, moving forward for non-public infrastructure. And I think that those are, a handful of examples. I think the list goes on, but those are, I think, amongst the most effective at this point.
Very good, thank you. We got one last question we're going to deal with, and then we'll wrap it up. Now throw it out to whoever wants to answer this. What would be more meaningful inclusion of local perspective than national policy discussions? What would they look like to you? Lynn, why don't you jump on that one?
I'm sorry, can you repeat it? What would be best to have conversations? Is that the question?
Yeah. It's what would more meaningful inclusion of local perspectives than the national policy discussions look like to you? I guess we're asking what type of discussion should we be having?
Sure. I think engagement, it's really hard to engage specifically at each individual state's level, like at the local level. You could have conversations at the state level. I think the organizations that we're representing here today are a great tool for us to have those conversations and then bring those conversations to the federal level. We are amazingly resilient as far as coming to agreement. The problems don't seem to have a partisan bent to them. The agreements about what we need to do are very much based on emergency management needs at the local level, and that's not partisan. We do have to deal with that at our levels with our own jurisdictions, but having those that feedback come from those partnerships, both with IAEM and NEMA, I think are very valuable.
And Dave, if I could jump in real quick, I think the biggest part of this is engaging with local emergency managers. As we're watching things unfold right now with this conversation with FEMA, it's the one voice that's missing from the table. If you really look at this, we have on the FEMA Review Council, we have 2 state directors, we have a local sheriff, we have a local mayor. There's not a local emergency manager on the Review Council at all. We have 2 great organizations between NEMA and IAM that access and really represent emergency managers at the state and local levels. And we are standing by, ready and willing to help. We just need somebody that's willing to have conversation with us. And the reality is that we have for a long time acknowledged that there are issues with the system as it is. We know there is a lot of room for improvement. You heard Lynn and I both talk about the need to simplify things. It's too complex. It's too cumbersome. There's a lot of room for improvement. And the reality is that we have a lot of the answers that you're looking for. But somebody's got to ask us the question for us to be able to answer it. And we are more than happy to sit down and have conversations. IAM and NEMA, we know the landscape, we know the players, we know the people who are out there. And, if you want to know what local emergency managers to talk to, call me. I can tell you some people that'd be great to talk to. I can tell you some people you probably don't need to talk to. But, at the end of the day, we all want to see things get better. We want to see an improvement. All we're asking for is just an opportunity to have those conversations.
Josh, thank you. Don, I'm going to, well, first of all, thank the panel very much. And Josh, hopefully you got some very influential Hill staffers watching this, and they'll take that message back to their congressional members, and hopefully we'll get a good audience. So thank all of you there. I know how busy you are. Even the Hill staffers, I know how busy you are. The panelists, I know how busy you get. Thanks for the time for doing this. So Don, I will turn it back over to you to wrap it up.
Thank you, Chief. And again, another note of appreciation to our speakers today. And Chief, a special note of appreciation to you for moderating our discussion on these very important topics. I'd also like to thank our audience for your participation and for your questions. Please feel free to contact the representatives from our host organizations whose names and contact information are provided on the screen now with additional follow-up questions or for more information on the topics we've discussed. As a reminder, a recording of today's session will be distributed to all invitees. And on behalf of the Center for Homeland Defense and Security and today's host, BuildStrong America, IAEM, and NEMA, thank you again for joining us. Have a good day.